Speciation is the creation of new species as a result of evolution. So we've already talked about divergent evolution. We said this is when a population accumulates differences over time. They started out with a common ancestor, and because they adapted to their habitat, they became slightly different. A good example of that would be our Darwins Finches that we've talked about several times over here. As a result of divergent evolution over time, eventually the differences become so great within these different species that they no longer interbreed. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But when that happens, that's called speciation, the formation of new species through the process of divergent evolution. So the common ancestor, we know, is the original species before the changes occurred. And then the new species are created through divergent evolution. So you can see here's your common ancestor. Here's species 1, species 2. It can be many, many species, as we saw with the finches. So here's an example. It says, through ballast water released from the international trading ships, a species of crab from Asia is introduced to the Atlantic shore of North America. To survive, the crab species must adapt by eating a different species of clams found in the Atlantic. The available clams in the Atlantic have harder shells, so only the crabs with the largest, strongest claws thrive. Over time, all of this crab species living in its new Atlantic home have larger, stronger claws than the average crab population in Asia. When crabs from the Atlantic population are reintroduced to their original Asian population, they will no longer interbreed. So how did natural selection lead to speciation in this example? Obviously, it caused a difference in the claw size, so much to the extent that they no longer recognize each other as the same species and will not breed together. Now, a lot of times in nature, they're not going to be reintroduced to the original species. They're so far away from them, like in this example, they're from Asia, and now they're ended up in a different location, so they probably wouldn't naturally be reintroduced to the original population. So remember, all of this is caused by mutations or random changes in the genes and also genetic drift. Remember, genetic drift is due to chance through some significant event that can cause speciation. So here we have a similar example, example 2. You have a small population of lizards from a mainland area hitching a ride on a boat and arriving on an island that has no other lizard species. They adapt quickly, they reproduce over many generations, and hundreds of years later, the island lizards have different traits than the mainland lizards, and the two populations will no longer interbreed, though like I said, they probably wouldn't be exposed to each other to do that anyway. So evolution can occur at different rates depending on what's going on in that population. So these are some factors that affect how fast evolution occurs. So population size, if you have a small population, that tends to evolve faster because the gene pool is smaller. So if something happens, that's going to cause that population to evolve faster and adapt faster. In a changing environment, obviously, that's going to cause those populations to adapt and evolve faster. A high rate of mutation is going to increase the rate of evolution, and a fast rate of reproduction is also going to increase the rate of evolution. So like I was mentioning before, some of these species that become different are not going to really have the chance to interbreed. And part of that is because they're physically, geographically separated. So you can see you got some birds way out in the Galapagos, and you have your birds that stayed on the mainland in South America. The Galapagos is not as close to the mainland as that picture is depicting. So those birds are probably not likely to ever come across each other. So another thing that can happen is when you do have geographic isolation, and you have some event that occurs where a physical barrier forms and divides a population into two groups, you might end up with subspecies, which are going to be very, very similar species that started out as the same species, and through some sort of barrier, they no longer interact, and they become slightly different and over time, they just won't be able to interbreed. So in this picture here, you have two species of fish. This is called the porkfish. At one point in time, there was a gap here. Okay, this is called the Isthmus of Panama. It arose 3.5 million years ago. So until 3.5 million years ago, these fish were one species. They looked similar, they interbred. When that Isthmus of Panama formed, there became a physical barrier between those two species, and you can see that they look different now. Okay, and if they were to get back together, they would probably not likely interbreed anymore. So speciation occurs due to some sort of reproductive isolation. So if there's a physical barrier or some other reason why they can't reproductively come together to make offspring. The most common form of that is called allopatric speciation, and it occurs, like I've been describing, where populations of a species are geographically isolated from breeding with one another, such as the fish on the previous slide. So here are some squirrels, some rodents that live in the Grand Canyon area. It says the vastness of Arizona's Grand Canyon and the Colorado River are insurmountable geographic barriers for small rodents. So if you're a little squirrel or a mouse, you're not going to be able to jump over the Grand Canyon and swim across the Colorado River in order to get to the animals on the other side. So you have two species of what are called antelope squirrels. They live in the canyon. The Harris antelope squirrel lives on the south rim of the canyon, and the white-tailed antelope squirrel lives on the north rim of the canyon. What makes the antelope squirrels of the Grand Canyon an example of allopatric speciation? And like I said, you got little teeny tiny squirrels not going to be able to cross that geographical barrier of the Grand Canyon and the river. So when you have something like Darwin's finches, where you have divergent evolution, a type of divergent evolution is adaptive radiation. This is when a single species diverges rapidly into several distinct species. So here's our finches again. Okay, we had a single species as their common ancestor from the mainland, and they evolved fairly rapidly into the different species that we see today, based on the food that was available on the island that they arrived at. Okay, and this is very common that you're going to see on islands in that situation. The Galapagos Islands are volcanic islands. They emerged out of the Pacific Ocean and they separated out, and that's how those birds ended up on different islands. You see that also in the Hawaiian Islands, or really any island chain, especially in volcanic island chains. These birds down here are called Hawaiian honey creepers. It's a funny name, but they have the same situation. They most likely came to Hawaii from somewhere else, since Hawaii emerged from the Pacific Ocean. It was not always present. They had to have come from somewhere else. But on the Hawaiian Islands, you're going to see a lot of birds that are similar, but slightly different. You can see you got slightly different colors, but the main thing, again, is going to be the beak shape. You know, obviously, this bird here has a different beak shape than this bird here, and that's because they did the same thing as Darwin's finches. They adapted to the food that was on the island where they landed. So in addition to geographic isolation, there are also some other types of reproductive isolation that would lead to speciation. We have temporal isolation. This is when a species develops different reproductive cycles. For example, one part of the population might start interbreeding in the spring, and one might start breeding in the fall. Temporal means time, so this is the timing of the mating cycle. An example down here, you have some crickets. This is the spring field cricket, and this is the fall field cricket. And they're very, very, very similar. The only difference is really that they don't mate at the same time of the year. So they're never going to come across each other to reproduce. Okay, so they became so different that they no longer interbreed, and they're two distinct species. This is mechanical isolation. This is something physical about the organisms that does not allow them to reproduce. It could be differences in the size, shape, or location of genitalia or some other physical aspect of their body. In this picture, you have two snails. Okay, these snails originally were the same species, but if you notice, one goes to the right, has a shell form that opens and coils to the right. That's this one. And one has a shell form that coils and opens to the left. And if they were to come across each other and attempt to mate successfully, that's not going to work out just because of their body shape. So that's called mechanical isolation. Behavioral isolation is where two populations do not interbreed because of differences in courtship or other mating behaviors. This could include the dances like in the birds of paradise that we saw in the videos. This could be a song. You hear birds singing all the time. They're looking for a mate, but they have to find a mate that's going to enjoy their singing. So you have some species here. This is the western meadowlark, and this is the eastern meadowlark. They are very similar. You probably could not tell the difference between them physically unless you looked really closely, but they sing different songs and they will not respond to the other meadowlark's song, as emphasized by this little cartoon here. Okay, they just have to respond, and if they don't respond, they're not going to mate. Okay, and that is it for speciation. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, post comments in Google Classroom, or otherwise get in touch with me. Thank you for listening. Bye.